In the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where rolling hills meet endless farmland, an unexpected discovery would forever change the lives of both man and beast. When 52-year-old Amish farmer Ezra Stoltzfus stumbles upon 3 starving dogs abandoned in his reclusive neighbor's barn, he makes a decision that sets in motion a chain of events filled with mystery, heartbreak, and ultimately the kind of love that transcends all boundaries. This is a story about second chances, the power of compassion, and how sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the darkest moments. The morning mist clung the Pennsylvania countryside like a gentle prayer, and Ezra Stoltzfus could feel autumn's crisp breath against his weathered face as he guided his horse-drawn cart down the familiar dirt path. At 52, Ezra had walked these same roads for most of his life, his calloused hands telling the story of countless seasons spent working the fertile soil that had sustained his family for 3 generations. His deep brown eyes, framed by laugh lines earned through decades of finding joy in simple pleasures, scanned the horizon as he made his way to check on his neighbor's property. Old Henrik Muller had been missing for nearly 2 weeks now, and the entire Amish community was growing concerned. The 84-year-old widow had always been a bit of a hermit, keeping to himself ever since his wife Martha passed away 5 years ago. But Henrik had never disappeared without a word to anyone. His small farmhouse sat empty, the mail piling up in his rusty mailbox, and his few chickens had long since wandered off in search of food and water. The county sheriff had been by twice, but with no signs of foul play, and Henrik's reputation as a wanderer in his younger days, the investigation had stalled. As Ezra's cart creaked to a stop in front of Henrik's weathered red barn, something felt different about the morning silence. Usually, the countryside was alive with the sounds of nature, birds chirping, insects buzzing, the distant lowing of cattle. But today, there was an unsettling quiet that made the hair on the back of Ezra's neck stand up. He tied his horse, Samuel, to the fence post and walked slowly toward the barn, his black boots crunching softly on the frost-covered grass. The barn door hung slightly ajar, which was unusual because Henrik, despite his advancing age and increasing forgetfulness, had always been meticulous about securing his buildings. Ezra paused at the entrance, listening carefully. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it, a soft whimpering, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the old wooden boards. Pushing the heavy door open wider, Ezra stepped into the dim interior of the barn. The smell hit him first, a mixture of hay, old wood, and something else, something that spoke of neglect and desperation. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out the familiar shapes of Henrik's old farming equipment, covered in dust and cobwebs. Rusty tools hung from hooks on the walls, and empty feed sacks lay crumpled in the corners. Then he saw that, in the far corner of the barn, huddled together on a bed of moldy straw, were 3 dogs, but these weren't the healthy, well-fed farm dogs that were common in the area. These animals were skeletal, their ribs clearly visible through matted, dirty fur. The largest of the 3, what appeared to be a German shepherd mix, lifted his head weakly as Ezra approached, his dark eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and terror that broke Ezra's heart instantly. The second dog, a smaller mixed breed with patches of black and white fur, lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes were closed and Ezra could see that she was barely clinging to life. The third dog, clearly the youngest of the group, was a golden-colored puppy who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Despite his obvious weakness, the puppy's tail gave the faintest of wags when he noticed Ezra's gentle approach. Ezra had always had a way with animals. Growing up on an Amish farm, he'd learned early that all of God's creatures deserved respect and care. He'd delivered countless foals, nursed sick calves back to health, and even once spent 3 days hand-feeding a baby bird that had fallen from its nest. But he had never seen animals in such a desperate state of neglect. Kneeling down slowly, Ezra extended his hand toward the German shepherd mix. speaking in the soft, melodic Pennsylvania Dutch dialect that his grandmother had taught him as a child. "Es ist okay, mein Freund," he whispered. "Ich will helfen." The dog's ears perked up slightly at the gentle tone, and after a moment's hesitation, he allowed Ezra to stroke his matted fur. As Ezra examined the three dogs more closely, his heart sank. They had clearly been locked in this barn for days, possibly weeks, without adequate food or water. An old bowl in the corner contained nothing but green, stagnant water, and there were no signs of food anywhere. How had Henrik allowed this to happen? The Henrik Muller that Ezra knew, while increasingly reclusive and sometimes confused, would never have deliberately harmed an animal. The sound of a car engine outside interrupted Ezra's thoughts. Through the barn's dusty window, he could see a black sedan pulling into Henrik's driveway. Two figures emerged from the car, a tall man in an expensive-looking suit, and a shorter, stockier man wearing sunglasses, despite the overcast morning. Something about their demeanor immediately put Ezra on edge. These weren't local people, and they certainly weren't friends of Henrik's coming to check on him. The tall man walked directly to Henrik's front door and began pounding on it aggressively. "Muller," he shouted, "we know you're in there. This ends today." When no answer came, the man nodded to his companion, who produced what looked like a crowbar from the trunk of their car. Ezra's protective instincts kicked in immediately. Whatever these men wanted with Henrik, it wasn't good, and Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that their presence was somehow connected to his neighbor's mysterious disappearance. More importantly, if these strangers discovered the three dying dogs in the barn, there was no telling what they might do. Moving as quietly as possible, Ezra gathered the weakest dog, the black and white female, into his arms. She was so light that it was like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in fur. The German Shepherd mix struggled to stand, his legs shaking with the effort, but his loyalty to his companions was evident, as he refused to leave without them. The golden puppy whimpered softly, but managed to take a few wobbly steps toward Ezra. Outside, the sound of splintering wood indicated that the strangers had forced their way into Henrik's house. Ezra knew he had only minutes before they might decide to search the barn as well. Making a decision that would change everything, he whispered a quick prayer and began what would become the most important rescue of his life. The German Shepherd, despite his weakness, seemed to understand that Ezra was trying to help. With tremendous effort, he managed to follow as Ezra carried the unconscious female dog toward his cart. The puppy, drawing on reserves of energy that seemed impossible given his condition, tottered along behind them, occasionally stumbling, but never giving up. As they reached the cart, Ezra could hear the men inside Henrik's house, their voices raised in anger, as they apparently found the place empty. "Check everywhere," the tall man was shouting. "The barn, the cellar, anywhere he might be hiding." Ezra's heart pounded as he gently placed the female dog in the back of his cart, covering her with a clean horse blanket he kept for emergencies. The German Shepherd required help climbing up, but once he was settled, he immediately positioned himself protectively next to his unconscious companion. The puppy, showing a spirit that defied his physical condition, somehow managed to scramble up into the cart with minimal assistance. Just as Ezra was untying Samuel from the fence post, he heard footsteps approaching the barn. There was no time to waste. With a gentle click of his tongue, he urged Samuel forward, and the cart began moving down the dirt road away from Henrik's farm. In the back of the cart, three dying dogs began a journey that would lead them toward hope, healing, and a love they had never known existed. As they moved further from the barn, Ezra couldn't shake the questions that swirled through his mind. Who were those men, and what did they want with Henrik? Where had his neighbor gone, and why had he left these innocent animals to starve? And most importantly, would he be able to save these three broken souls who had already endured so much suffering? The morning mist was beginning to lift as Ezra's cart rolled toward home, carrying its precious cargo toward an uncertain but hope-filled future. Behind them, the mysterious strangers continued their angry search, unaware that the barn's most important secrets had already been spirited away by a gentle Amish farmer whose heart wouldn't let him ignore the suffering of the innocent. What Ezra didn't know, Samuel's hooves clip-clop steadily down the country road, was that this rescue was only the beginning of a story that would test his faith, challenge his community's traditions, and ultimately reveal truths that would change everything he thought he knew about his quiet neighbor and the powerful forces that had been hunting him. Ezra's farmhouse came into view just as the morning sun broke through the lingering clouds, casting long shadows across his neatly tended fields. The white two-story house, with its simple lines and functional design, had been home to 4 generations of Stoltzfus family members. Today, it would become a sanctuary for 3 souls who had given up hope of ever feeling safe again. As the cart rolled into the barnyard, Ezra's wife Rebecca emerged from the chicken coop, her arms full of fresh eggs. At 48, Rebecca Stoltzfus was still the same gentle woman Ezra had fallen in love with 30 years ago, though her once golden hair now showed threads of silver beneath her white prayer covering. Her blue eyes, always quick to show compassion, immediately took in the scene before her. Her husband's worried expression and the mysterious bundles in the back of his cart. "Ezra," she called, setting down her basket and hurrying toward them. "Was it still?" Her Pennsylvania Dutch accent carried the concern that was evident in her voice. Rebecca had learned over their decades of marriage that when her husband had that particular look on his face, something significant was happening. "We have visitors, Rebecca," Ezra said softly, climbing down from the cart. "3 of them, and they're in terrible need." He gently pulled back the horse blanket, revealing the 3 emaciated dogs. Rebecca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in their condition. The female dog remained unconscious, her breathing so shallow that Rebecca had to look closely to see the rise and fall of her chest. The German Shepherd mix lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Rebecca's with a mixture of weariness and desperate hope. The golden puppy, somehow still clinging to life despite his obvious starvation, managed a weak tail wag at the sound of Rebecca's gentle voice. "Ach, mein Gott," Rebecca whispered, tears immediately springing to her eyes. Like her husband, she had been raised with a deep respect for all living creatures, and the sight of such unnecessary suffering cut her to the core. "Where did you find them, Ezra?" "Henrik's barn," Ezra replied grimly as he carefully lifted the unconscious female dog. "They were locked inside, no food, barely any water. Rebecca, I think they've been there since Henrik disappeared." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "And there were strangers at Henrik's place this morning. Dangerous-looking men who broke into his house." Rebecca's eyes widened with alarm, but she quickly pushed her fears aside. There would be time for questions later. Right now, 3 innocent lives hung in the balance. "Bring them into the kitchen," she said decisively. "I'll heat some water and get the medical supplies we keep for the livestock." The next several hours passed in a blur of careful, determined activity. Rebecca, who had assisted with countless animal births and injuries over the years, proved invaluable in assessing the dog's condition. The female, whom they began calling Grace because of the peaceful expression on her face, even in unconsciousness, was in the most critical state. Her dehydration was severe, and her body temperature dangerously low. The German Shepherd mix, who Ezra had started thinking of as guardian because of the protective way he watched over his companions, was more alert but equally malnourished. Despite his weakness, Guardian refused to leave Grace's side, positioning himself where he could see both her and the puppy at all times. The puppy, whose golden fur reminded Rebecca of summer wheat, earned the name Hope because of his remarkable will to survive. Even at what couldn't have been more than 6 months old, Hope showed a spirit that defied his physical condition. He accepted the small sips of warm water and tiny pieces of bread soaked in milk that Rebecca offered him, his tail wagging weakly with each small kindness. As the afternoon wore on, all 3 dogs began to show small signs of improvement. Grace's breathing became slightly deeper, and she even opened her eyes briefly when Rebecca gently stroked her matted fur. Guardian managed to drink some water on his own and even ate a small piece of boiled chicken that Rebecca had prepared. Hope, showing the resilience that puppies are known for, actually managed to stand and take a few steps before curling up against Guardian's warm side. It was during this time of focused care that Ezra shared with Rebecca the strange encounter he'd witnessed at Henrik's farm. The two mysterious men, their expensive car so out of place in their rural community, and the aggressive way they had forced entry into Henrik's house painted a troubling picture. "I've been thinking about it all day," Ezra said as he sat on the kitchen floor next to Guardian, who had finally allowed himself to relax enough to rest his massive head on Ezra's lap. Henrik may have kept to himself these last few years, but he was never the type to neglect animals. Something happened to him, Rebecca, something that prevented him from caring for these three. Rebecca, who was carefully cleaning Grace's matted fur with warm, soapy water, nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think those men had something to do with Henrik's disappearance?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Ezra admitted, "but I have a feeling that saving these dogs might be more complicated than we thought." He paused, his weathered fingers gently stroking Guardian's ears. "There's something else, Rebecca. When I was loading them into the cart, Guardian here, he looked at me like he was trying to tell me something, like he had witnessed things that no creature should ever have to see." As if understanding the conversation, Guardian lifted his head and looked directly at Ezra. In those dark, intelligent eyes was a depth of pain that spoke of trauma far beyond simple neglect and starvation. This dog had seen something terrible, and Ezra was beginning to suspect that whatever had happened to Henrik Muller was far more sinister than anyone in their peaceful community could imagine. Evening was approaching when they heard the sound of a car coming up their long driveway. Ezra quickly moved to the window and felt his blood run cold. It was the same black sedan from Henrik's farm, and the two strangers were getting out with the confident stride of men who were used to getting what they wanted. "Rebecca," Ezra said urgently, "take the dogs upstairs to our bedroom, quickly." Without question, Rebecca scooped up Hope while Ezra gently helped Guardian to his feet. Grace, still weak but now conscious, managed to walk slowly with Rebecca's encouragement. Within minutes, all three dogs were hidden away in the master bedroom, with Guardian positioning himself protectively in front of his companions. The knock on the front door, when it came, was loud and aggressive. Ezra took a deep breath, whispered a quick prayer, and opened the door to find the two men from Henrik's farm standing on his porch. Up close, they were even more intimidating than they had appeared from a distance. The tall man, who seemed to be the leader, had cold, grey eyes and the kind of smile that never reached his face. His companion was shorter but broader, with hands that looked like they had seen their share of violence. Both men wore clothes that would have cost more than most Amish families spent in 6 months, and their presence felt like a dark cloud settling over the peaceful farmhouse. "Good evening," the tall man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Ezra couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry to bother you so late. My name is Vincent Torino, and this is my associate, Mr. Kane. We're looking for our friend Henrik Muller. We were supposed to meet him today, but he seems to have stepped out. We thought perhaps you might know where he went." Ezra studied the man's face. Everything about Vincent Torino screamed danger, from his too perfect smile to the way his eyes constantly scanned the farmhouse behind Ezra, as if looking for something specific. "I'm afraid I haven't seen Henrik in about 2 weeks, Ezra replied honestly. "The whole community has been worried about him." 2 weeks? Kane spoke for the first time, his voice rough like gravel. "That's interesting, because according to our information, Henrik was supposed to be taking care of something very important for us, something that can't afford to be neglected." Torino shot his companion a sharp look, clearly annoyed that Kane had revealed too much information. "What my associate means," Torino said smoothly, "is that Henrik was helping us with a business matter. Nothing that would interest the local community, of course. Just some financial arrangements." Ezra's instincts told him that these men were lying about everything, and the way they kept looking past him into his house made him deeply uncomfortable. "I wish I could help you," he said, starting to close the door, "but I really don't know anything about Henrik's business dealings." "Wait," Torino said, putting his hand against the door to keep it open. "You wouldn't mind if we took a look around your property, would you? Henrik might have mentioned your farm to us. Said he sometimes kept things here for safekeeping." The request sent alarm bells ringing in Ezra's head. These men weren't just looking for Henrik, they were looking for something specific, and they seemed to think it might be hidden on his property. "I'm afraid that wouldn't be appropriate," Ezra said firmly. "If you have concerns about Henrik, I suggest you speak with the county sheriff. Sheriff Morrison has been handling the case of Henrik's disappearance." Kane took a step forward, his intention clearly to intimidate, but Torino held up a hand to stop him. "Of course," Torino said, his smile never wavering even as his eyes grew noticeably colder. "We certainly don't want to cause any trouble in such a peaceful community." "But Mr. Stoltzfus," he paused, and Ezra realized with a chill that this man knew his name even though he hadn't introduced himself. "We really do need to find what Henrik was keeping for us. It's worth a great deal of money, and there are people who are growing very impatient." The threat in Torino's voice was unmistakable, and Ezra felt a cold fear settle in his stomach. These weren't ordinary businessmen, and whatever they wanted from Henrik was serious enough that they were willing to threaten an Amish farmer to get it. "I'm sorry I can't help you," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "Good evening, gentlemen." This time when Ezra moved to close the door, Torino didn't try to stop him. But as the door clicked shut, Ezra heard Kane say something in a low voice that made his blood freeze. "Boss, what if the old man hid it with the dogs? What if that's why he kept them in the barn?" From upstairs came a barely audible whimper, and Ezra realized with growing horror that Hope had somehow sensed the presence of these men. The puppy had been through trauma with these people before, and even in his weakened state, he remembered them. As the black sedan pulled away from the farmhouse, Ezra sank into a chair at his kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly. Rebecca appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale with worry. "Are they gone?" she asked softly. "For now," Ezra replied. "But Rebecca, I think we're in serious trouble. Those dogs aren't just victims of neglect. They're witnesses to something terrible, and those men know it." Upstairs, Guardian had moved to the bedroom window and was watching the departing car with the intensity of a soldier on guard duty. Somehow, this brave dog knew that the danger wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As darkness settled over the Stoltzfus farm, 3 rescued dogs and the family that had saved them were about to discover that some secrets are worth killing for, and that sometimes the most innocent among us carry the heaviest burdens of truth. The night was going to be long, and by morning everything would change forever. The old grandfather clock in the Stoltzfus hallway had just chimed midnight when Guardian began to pace. Despite his weakened condition, the German Shepherd mix moved restlessly around the master bedroom, his ears constantly swiveling toward every errand that drifted through the night air. Ezra, who had been dozing fitfully in the rocking chair beside the makeshift bed they'd created for the dogs, opened his eyes to find Guardian staring intently out the window. "What is it, boy?" Ezra whispered, moving carefully to avoid waking Rebecca, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of tending to Grace and Hope. The female dog was breathing more steadily now, and Hope had managed to eat a small bowl of warm milk, mixed with bread, but both were still critically weak. Guardian looked up at Ezra with those intelligent dark eyes, and then back toward the window. Something in the dog's posture made Ezra's blood run cold. This wasn't the restlessness of a recovering animal. This was the alertness of a guard dog who sensed approaching danger. Ezra moved quietly to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing but the familiar silhouettes of his barn and outbuildings against the star-filled sky. Then, at the edge of his vision, he caught a flicker of movement near the old oak tree that marked the boundary of his property. Someone was out there watching his house. Moving as silently as possible, Ezra made his way downstairs and retrieved his father's old binoculars from the kitchen drawer. When he returned to the bedroom window, he could make out two figures crouched behind the oak tree. Even in the darkness, he could tell they were the same men who had visited earlier. Torino and Kane hadn't given up. They were conducting surveillance, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Guardian pressed against Ezra's leg, and the farmer was struck by the courage this broken animal was showing. Despite everything he'd endured, Guardian was still trying to protect those he considered his family. The dog's loyalty was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "I know, boy," Ezra whispered, his hand resting on Guardian's head. "You've seen these men before, haven't you? You know what they're capable of." Guardian's low whine seemed to confirm Ezra's suspicion, and the farmer felt his resolve strengthen. Whatever these men wanted, whatever Henrik had been involved in, Ezra wasn't going to let them hurt these innocent animals again. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor that would change everything. Just after dawn, as Ezra was feeding his livestock and keeping one eye on the tree line where the surveillance had continued through the night, a rusted pickup truck rumbled up his driveway. Behind the wheel was Jacob Weber, Henrik's only living relative and a man Ezra had known since childhood. Jacob was Henrik's great-nephew, a 35-year-old carpenter who had left the Amish community years ago but still maintained close ties with his great-uncle. He was a good man, though troubled by his decision to leave the faith of his fathers, and Ezra could see immediately that Jacob was carrying a heavy burden. "Ezra," Jacob said as he climbed out of his truck, his face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "I need to talk to you about Uncle Henrik. I think he might be dead." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd been hoping against hope that Henrik had simply wandered off, perhaps visiting distant relatives or dealing with some personal crisis. But looking at Jacob's haunted expression, Ezra realized that his worst fears might be coming true. "Come inside," Ezra said quietly. "Rebecca has coffee on, and there are things we need to discuss." As they walked toward the house, Ezra noticed that Jacob kept glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if he too sensed they were being watched. In the kitchen, over steaming mugs of Rebecca's strong coffee, Jacob told a story that made Ezra's blood run cold. 3 weeks ago, Henrik had called Jacob in a state of panic. The old man had gotten involved with some very dangerous people, and now he needed help disappearing before they could find him. "He wouldn't tell me exactly what he'd done," Jacob said, his hands shaking slightly as he held his coffee mug. "But he said he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd agreed to hide something for these men, and now they were demanding it back. The problem was, Uncle Henrik couldn't give it back because he'd already turned it over to the authorities." Ezra leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What kind of something?" Jacob glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. "Evidence. Uncle Henrik said he'd been storing evidence of some kind of criminal operation, thinking he was just helping out some businessmen who needed a secure place to keep important documents. But when he got curious and looked at what he was hiding, he realized it was proof of something terrible. So he took it all to the FBI field office in Philadelphia." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in Ezra's mind, and the picture they formed was terrifying. Henrik hadn't disappeared voluntarily. He'd been eliminated because he'd betrayed some very dangerous people. And now those same people were searching for whatever evidence remained, convinced that Henrik had hidden backup copies somewhere. "Jacob," Ezra said carefully, "did Henrik ever mention keeping dogs?" Jacob's eyes widened with surprise. "Dogs? Yes, actually. He called me about 2 weeks ago and said he'd found 3 stray dogs and was keeping them in his barn temporarily. He seemed really attached to them, said they were good company, and helped him feel less alone." "Why do you ask?" Before Ezra could answer, Rebecca appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale with urgency. "Ezra," she called softly, "you need to come up here. Grace is awake, and she's trying to tell us something." The 3 adults climbed the stairs quietly, Jacob's eyes widening in shock when he saw the 3 dogs in the bedroom. Grace was indeed awake, though still weak, and she was focused intently on something near the window. Guardian had positioned himself protectively between Grace and the newcomer, but when Grace whined softly and nudged something with her nose, Guardian stepped aside to reveal what she was showing them. Hidden in Grace's matted fur, barely visible against her black and white coat, was a small plastic bag. Inside the bag was what appeared to be a micro SD card, the kind used in cameras and phones. Grace had been carrying it the entire time, concealed so cleverly that even during their careful cleaning and medical treatment, they'd missed it completely. "Mein Gott," Jakob breathed, reaching for the tiny storage device. "This is it. This is what they're looking for." Ezra's hands shook as he carefully extracted the SD card from its protective wrapping. Such a small thing to have cost Henrik his life, and to still threaten the lives of 3 innocent dogs and everyone trying to help them. But as he held the tiny piece of technology, Ezra realized that this card might also be the key to justice for his murdered neighbor. "We need to get this to the authorities," Ezra said, but Jakob quickly shook his head. "Uncle Henrik didn't trust the local police," Jakob said grimly. "He said there were people involved in this thing at every level, and he didn't know who could be trusted. That's why he went directly to the FBI in Philadelphia. But Ezra, if these men killed Uncle Henrik for betraying them, what do you think they'll do to you and your family?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Ezra felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He looked at the 3 dogs who had already suffered so much, at his beloved wife who was now in danger because of his decision to help, and at Jakob, who was risking his own life by coming here with the truth. From downstairs came the sound of car engines, and Guardian immediately moved to the window, his body tense with alertness. Peering out, Ezra saw not 1, but 3 black sedans pulling into his driveway. Torino and Kane were back, and this time they'd brought reinforcements. "They know," Jakob said, his voice filled with despair. "Somehow they know we have what they're looking for." But Ezra was already moving, his mind racing with possibilities. "Jakob, take your truck and drive to the bishop's house. Tell him what's happening, and ask him to contact the FBI field office in Philadelphia. Tell them that Henrik Muller's evidence survived and that we have proof of what happened to him." "What about you?" Jakob asked, even as he prepared to follow Ezra's instructions. "Rebecca and I will take the dogs and head for the old Miller homestead up in the hills." Ezra replied, referring to an abandoned farm that had been empty for years. "There are caves up there where we can hide until help arrives." Rebecca was already gathering supplies, her movements quick and efficient despite the fear in her eyes. She'd lived as an Amish woman, long enough to know that sometimes survival required difficult choices, and she trusted her husband completely. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the morning air, followed by Torino's voice calling out in that deceptively pleasant tone, "Mr. Stoltzfus, we need to have another conversation. And this time, we're not leaving empty-handed." Guardian growled low in his throat, the first truly aggressive sound he'd made since his rescue. Grace struggled to her feet, still weak but determined to stand with her protector. Even little Hope, barely more than a puppy, positioned himself bravely beside the 2 adult dogs. These 3 animals, who had every reason to cower and hide, were instead preparing to fight alongside the humans who had saved them. Their loyalty and courage in the face of such danger brought tears to Rebecca's eyes and strengthened Ezra's resolve. "We go together," Ezra said firmly, scooping up the SD card and sliding it into his shirt pocket. "All of us, no one gets left behind." As Torino's men surrounded the house and began forcing their way inside, Ezra led his unlikely family group out through the back door and toward the old root cellar that connected to a network of caves his grandfather had shown him as a child. Behind them, the sound of splintering wood and shouted curses indicated that their escape had been discovered. The chase was on, and 3 rescued dogs who had already endured more than any creature should have to face were about to become the key to exposing exposing a criminal conspiracy that reached further than anyone in their peaceful community could have imagined. In his pocket, the SD card that Grace had protected with her life contained secrets that would either save them all or get them killed. And somewhere in the hills above Lancaster County, a gentle Amish farmer and his family were about to discover just how far they were willing to go to protect the innocent and seek justice for the dead. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, but for Ezra Stoltzfus and his four-legged companions, the darkest part of their journey was just beginning. The old Miller homestead sat like a forgotten memory against the backdrop of Pennsylvania's rolling hills, its weathered gray buildings nearly invisible among the overgrown maple and oak trees that had reclaimed much of the property over the past 15 years. Ezra remembered playing here as a child when old Samuel Miller still worked the land and his wife Hannah tended the most beautiful vegetable garden in 3 counties. Now the house stood empty with broken windows staring blindly across the valley, and the barn leaned precariously to one side, its red paint long since faded to the color of dried blood. But it was the caves that Ezra remembered most clearly, the network of natural limestone caverns that his grandfather had shown him during a memorable camping trip when Ezra was just 10 years old. These caves saved lives during the Underground Railroad, his grandfather had whispered with reverence as they explored the cool, dark passages. Sometimes the most important thing a man can do is provide sanctuary for those who have nowhere else to run. Now, 42 years later, Ezra found himself leading his own desperate group toward those same caves, carrying hope in his arms, while Rebecca supported Grace's faltering steps. Guardian, despite his weakness, moved with the determined gait of a soldier on a mission, frequently pausing to look back toward the valley below, where columns of black smoke were beginning to rise from the direction of the Stoltzfus farm. They had made it out just in time. Through the trees, Ezra could see the orange glow that meant Torino's men had set fire to his house, probably hoping to destroy any evidence that might have been hidden there. The sight of his family's century-old home being consumed by flames filled Ezra with a grief so profound that he had to stop and lean against a tree to keep from falling. "Ezra," Rebecca said softly, her own voice thick with unshed tears, "the house was just wood and stone. What matters is that we're all safe." She gestured toward the 3 dogs who had somehow found the strength to make the difficult climb up the hillside. "What matters is that we can still save them and maybe find justice for Henrik." Her words reminded Ezra of why they were running, and he felt the small weight of the SD card in his shirt pocket, like a burning coal against his chest. This tiny piece of technology contained secrets that had already cost Henrik his life and destroyed the only home Ezra had ever known. But it also contained the truth, and in the end, the truth was always worth fighting for. The entrance to the main cave was hidden behind a curtain of wild grapevines, exactly as Ezra remembered it from his childhood. As they pushed through the natural camouflage, the temperature dropped noticeably, and they found themselves in a spacious chamber that extended back into the hillside, further than their eyes could penetrate. Sunlight filtering through cracks in the limestone ceiling created an almost cathedral-like atmosphere, and the sound of their footsteps echoed softly off the stone walls. "This will do," Ezra said, setting Hope down gently on a bed of soft moss that had grown near the cave's entrance. "We'll be safe here while Jacob contacts the FBI, and the dogs can rest without fear." But even as he spoke, Ezra could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors, and through the cave entrance, he caught glimpses of aircraft circling the valley below. Torino's organization was more extensive and better equipped than he had imagined, and their pursuers weren't going to give up easily. Guardian had positioned himself at the cave entrance, his body alert and ready despite his obvious exhaustion. Grace lay beside Hope, her breathing more labored after the difficult climb, but her eyes remained watchful and aware. These 3 animals had survived horrors that would have broken lesser spirits, and now they were preparing to face whatever came next, with the kind of quiet courage that Ezra had always associated with the noblest aspects of God's creation. It was while they were settling into their rocky sanctuary that Grace began to exhibit behavior that caught Rebecca's attention. The black and white dog kept moving toward a particular section of the cave wall, whining softly and pawing at the limestone as if trying to dig through solid rock. "What is it, girl?" Rebecca asked, kneeling beside Grace and examining the wall where the dog was focused. At first it looked like nothing more than natural stone formation, but as Rebecca's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she began to make out something that made her gasp with surprise. Carved into the limestone, so weathered that they were barely visible, were a series of symbols and letters. Some appeared to be dates from the 1850s, and others looked like initials or brief messages. This section of the cave had been used by Underground Railroad conductors to communicate with each other, leaving coded messages for those who came after them. But what had caught Grace's attention wasn't the historical graffiti hidden among the old carvings, barely visible unless someone knew exactly where to look, were fresh scratches in the stone. Someone had been here recently, and they had left a message that would change everything the Stoltzfus family thought they knew about Henrik Muller's disappearance. "Ezra," Rebecca called softly, her voice filled with excitement and fear in equal measure. "You need to see this." The fresh scratches, when examined closely, formed letters and numbers that spelled out a brief but crucial message. Box 847, First National, Lancaster, trust no one else. Evidence copied, truth will survive. Ezra stared at the message, his mind racing as he realized what it meant. Henrik hadn't just turned over evidence to the FBI, he'd made copies and hidden them in a safety deposit box at the First National Bank in Lancaster. And somehow he'd managed to get here to leave this message before Torino's men caught up with him. "He knew this place," Ezra said wonderingly. "Somehow Henrik knew about these caves, and he knew we might come here." The sound of voices echoing across the valley interrupted Ezra's thoughts, and Guardian's low growl confirmed what they all feared. Their pursuers had found the trail and were beginning to search the hillside systematically. Through the cave entrance, they could see flashlight beams moving among the trees, getting closer with each passing minute. "We need to go deeper," Ezra said, gathering hope into his arms once again. "There are other chambers further back, places where we can hide until help arrives." But as they prepared to move deeper into the cave system, Grace collapsed. The difficult climb and the stress of their escape had pushed her weakened body beyond its limits, and she lay on the moss, breathing in short, painful gasps. Guardian immediately moved to her side, pressing his body against hers, as if trying to share his remaining strength with his companion. "She can't go any further," Rebecca said, her voice breaking as she knelt beside the dying dog. "Ezra, she's not going to make it." The sound of approaching voices was getting louder, and they could hear Kane's rough voice calling out orders to the search teams. They had perhaps 10 minutes before the cave was discovered, and Grace was too weak to be moved without killing her. It was then that Guardian did something that would stay with Ezra for the rest of his life. The German Shepherd mix looked directly at Ezra with those intelligent dark eyes, then moved to the cave entrance and barked once, loudly enough that the sound would certainly carry to their pursuers. Guardian was offering himself as a distraction, sacrificing his own safety to buy time for the others to escape. "No," Ezra said firmly, moving to Guardian's side. "We don't abandon family, and you three are family now." He looked at Rebecca, saw the same determination in her eyes that he felt in his own heart, and knew that they had made their choice. They would make their stand here, in this ancient sanctuary that had sheltered other desperate souls more than a century ago. They would protect these three innocent animals who had already suffered more than any creature should have to endure. And they would trust that justice would ultimately prevail. From his shirt pocket, Ezra removed the SD card and looked around the cave for a hiding place that even Torino's men wouldn't think to search. His eyes fell on a small crevice high up on the cave wall, a natural pocket in the limestone that would require someone to climb 20 feet of smooth rock to reach. With Rebecca's help, Ezra managed to scale the wall and slip the card into the hiding place, covering it with a small stone that looked like part of the natural formation. "If something happens to us," Ezra told Rebecca as he climbed back down, "Jacob will know to look for Henrik's message. He'll find the safety deposit box and the truth will come out." The The voices outside were very close now, and they could see the glow of flashlights beginning to penetrate the grapevine curtain that concealed the cave entrance. Guardian had positioned himself protectively in front of Grace and Hope, while Rebecca knelt beside the two weakest dogs, her hands gently stroking their fur as she whispered words of comfort. Ezra stood at the center of their small group, his weathered farmer's hands steady despite the fear in his heart. He thought of Henrik, dying alone and afraid, but still brave enough to hide the truth for future generations to find. He thought of his burning house and the life he and Rebecca had built together over 30 years of marriage. And he thought of the 3 dogs who had somehow found the strength to trust again, even after everything they had endured. The grapevines at the cave entrance began to rustle, and Torino's voice called out with mock politeness, "Mr. Stoltzfus, we know you're in there. This has gone on long enough. Come out now, and we can discuss this like civilized people." But Ezra had learned enough about Vincent Torino to know that there was nothing civilized about the man, and that any discussion would end with Grace, Guardian, and Hope dead, along with anyone who had tried to help them. "We're not coming out," Ezra called back, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained his family through generations of hardship. "And we're not giving you what you're looking for." Torino's laughter echoed off the cave walls, cold and humorless. "Mr. Stoltzfus, you're a farmer. I'm a businessman who deals with problems professionally. You can't possibly think you can win this." But as Ezra looked down at Guardian's brave face and saw the way the dog's eyes never wavered from the cave entrance, he realized that they had already won something far more important than Torino could understand. They had chosen to stand with the innocent against the powerful, to risk everything for those who couldn't defend themselves, and to ensure that the truth would survive even if they didn't. In the distance, the sound of helicopter rotors was getting louder, and Ezra allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe Jacob had succeeded in reaching the authorities. Maybe help was on the way. But even if it wasn't, even if they were about to face the worst that evil men could do, Ezra knew that they had made the right choice. Sometimes the most important thing a person could do was provide sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to run, and that was exactly what they intended to do, until their last breath. The grapevines parted, and Torino stepped into the cave, flanked by Cain and 2 other men. Ezra didn't recognize. All 4 were armed, and their intentions were written clearly on their faces. The final confrontation was about to begin. Vincent Torino stepped into the cave with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through intimidation or violence. His expensive suit looked absurdly out of place against the ancient limestone walls, and his polished shoes slipped slightly on the moss-covered floor. But his grey eyes remained cold and calculating as they took in the scene before him. An Amish farmer and his wife kneeling protectively beside 3 emaciated dogs in what he clearly considered a pathetic last stand. "This is really quite touching," Torino said, his voice carrying that same mock politeness that had chilled Ezra during their first encounter. "A farmer playing hero for some stray dogs. But I'm afraid the time for games has ended, Mr. Stoltzfus. My employers are growing impatient, and patience has never been one of their virtues." Cain and the 2 other armed men spread out to block any possible escape routes, their weapons drawn but pointed toward the cave floor in a show of casual menace. These were professionals who had done this kind of work before, and their relaxed confidence spoke of countless other confrontations that had ended badly for their victims. Guardian struggled to his feet, placing himself between the armed men and his family. Despite his weakness, the German shepherd's stance was unmistakably protective, and the low growl rumbling in his chest carried a warning that transcended species barriers. Even in his broken condition, this dog was prepared to fight to the death for those he loved. "That's the one," Cain said, pointing at Guardian with his pistol. "That's the dog that bit Ricky when we were loading them into the van. Son of a bitch took a chunk out of his arm before we could get him secured." The casual admission of their crime sent a surge of rage through Ezra that surprised him with its intensity. These men were talking about kidnapping and torturing innocent animals as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, and their lack of remorse revealed the true depths of their moral bankruptcy. "So you did take them from Henrik," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. "You tortured them to try to make Henrik talk." Torino shrugged as if the suffering of 3 innocent creatures was barely worth acknowledging. "Old Henrik was being stubborn about returning our property. We thought that watching his precious pets suffer might motivate him to be more cooperative. Unfortunately, the foolish man chose to be heroic instead of practical." Grace whimpered softly from her position on the moss, and Rebecca's arms tightened protectively around the dying dog. The black and white female was fading fast, her breathing shallow and labored, but her eyes remained fixed on Guardian, with a devotion that spoke of bonds forged through shared suffering. "Where is Henrik now?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a strength that made even Torino's men shift uncomfortably. "Henrik Muller made some very poor choices," Torino replied with that same chilling smile. "He betrayed people who had trusted him with valuable property, and he discovered that such betrayals carry consequences. Let's just say that Henrik won't be causing any more problems for anyone." The confirmation of what they had already suspected hit Ezra like a physical blow. Henrik was dead, murdered by these men for the crime of developing a conscience. The gentle old man who had once spent hours teaching Ezra how to whittle during long winter evenings had died alone and afraid, probably knowing that his beloved dogs would suffer the same fate. Hope, the golden puppy who had somehow maintained his will to live through everything, struggled to his feet and took a few wobbly steps toward Torino. But instead of cowering or showing fear, Hope sat down directly in front of the criminal and looked up at him with the kind of pure, innocent trust that only puppies possessed. For just a moment, something flickered across Torino's face that might have been conscience or regret. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation that had made him successful in a business where weakness meant death. "The SD card, Mr. Stoltzfus," Torino said, extending his manicured hand. "Give it to me now, and I might consider letting your wife live long enough to bury you properly." Ezra looked around the cave, noting the positions of the 4 armed men and calculating his chances of protecting his family. They were surrounded, outgunned, and trapped in a confined space with nowhere to run. By any rational assessment, their situation was hopeless. But then Guardian did something extraordinary. Despite his weakness, the German shepherd began to move slowly around the cave, his nose to the ground as if following a scent trail. At first, Torino's men watched him with amusement, assuming the dog was simply disoriented or confused. But Ezra realized what Guardian was really doing, and the knowledge filled him with a mixture of hope and terror. Guardian was tracking. He was using his incredible canine senses to locate something that his human companions had missed, something that might change the balance of power in this deadly confrontation. The dog's path led him to a pile of rocks near the back of the cave, where he began pawing at the stones with renewed energy. Hidden beneath the carefully arranged rocks was something that made Cain curse with surprise and raise his weapon. It was Henrik's body. The old man had made it to the cave after all, had left his message on the wall, and hidden the evidence he'd promised to protect. But the effort had cost him his life, and he had died here alone in the darkness, probably knowing that Torino's men would eventually find him. But Henrik had left more than just his body in this ancient sanctuary. Clutched in his skeletal fingers was a small notebook, its pages filled with names, dates, and detailed accounts of the criminal organization that had ultimately killed him. The evidence on the SD card wasn't the only proof of their crimes. Henrik had kept meticulous records of everything he had witnessed and learned during his time as their unwilling accomplice. "Clever old bastard," Torino said, but there was genuine admiration in his voice as he looked down at Henrik's remains. "He led us on quite a chase, didn't he? Even dead, he's still causing problems." The sound of helicopter rotors was getting much louder now, and through the cave entrance they could see aircraft circling overhead in patterns that suggested a coordinated search operation. Cain moved to the entrance and peered out through the grapevines, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "Boss," Cain said urgently, "we've got federal agents swarming all over this hillside. Looks like that nephew of his got through to somebody important." For the first time since entering the cave, Torino's composure showed cracks. His organization might be powerful, but they weren't equipped to take on the full resources of the federal government in an open confrontation. This was supposed to have been a simple cleanup operation, not a pitched battle with FBI agents. "Then we finish this quickly," Torino said, raising his own weapon and pointing it directly at Ezra's chest. "The SD card, Mr. Stoltzfus. Right now, or I start shooting everyone in this cave, beginning with your wife." It was then that Hope, the golden puppy who had shown such courage throughout their ordeal, did something that would be remembered in the Stoltzfus family for generations to come. Despite his weakness and youth, Hope somehow found the strength to leap at Torino's gun hand, his small teeth clamping down on the man's wrist with surprising force. Torino screamed in pain and surprise, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the cave ceiling as he tried to shake off the determined puppy. In that moment of chaos, Guardian summoned reserves of strength that seemed impossible, given his condition, and launched himself at Kane, his powerful jaws closing around the man's gun arm with the devastating force of his German Shepherd heritage. The other two gunmen raised their weapons, but Rebecca had already moved, throwing herself across Grace's body to shield the dying dog from any stray bullets. Ezra lunged toward Henrik's notebook, determined to protect the evidence that had cost his neighbor's life. The cave erupted in chaos as men and dogs fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Hope, despite being shaken violently by Torino, refused to release his grip on the man's wrist. Guardian, showing the courage and strength that had made his breed legendary, continued his attack on Kane even as the man beat him with his free hand. But the confrontation was ended not by violence, but by a voice that cut through the chaos like a sword of justice. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground. Now." The cave entrance was suddenly filled with federal agents, their weapons trained on Torino's men with the precision of professionals who had dealt with dangerous criminals before. Special Agent Sarah Chen, a small but formidable woman who had been tracking Torino's organization for 3 years, stepped forward with her badge clearly visible. "Vincent Torino," she said with evident satisfaction, "you're under arrest for the murders of Henrik Muller and 7 other individuals, conspiracy to commit murder, animal cruelty, arson, and about 15 other federal charges that are going to keep you busy for the rest of your life." Torino's men, faced with overwhelming odds, slowly lowered their weapons and raised their hands. But Torino himself seemed unable to accept that his carefully planned operation had been destroyed by an Amish farmer and 3 half-dead dogs. "This is impossible," he said, staring at Hope, who was still attached to his bleeding wrist. "We had everything under control. How could it all go wrong?" Agent Chen smiled grimly as she gestured for her team to secure the crime scene. "You made one critical mistake, Mr. Torino. You underestimated the power of love and loyalty. These dogs didn't just survive your torture. They found people who cared enough about them to risk everything for their safety, and that made all the difference." As the federal agents took Torino and his men into custody, Ezra knelt beside Grace, who was breathing her last breaths on the moss-covered cave floor. The black and white dog looked up at him with eyes that somehow conveyed gratitude despite her pain, and her tail managed one final weak wag before she closed her eyes forever. Guardian, exhausted by his final battle, collapsed beside his fallen companion, his body shaking with grief and exhaustion. Hope, finally releasing his grip on Torino's wrist, stumbled over to join Guardian in mourning the loss of their friend. Rebecca wept openly as she held Grace's still form, and even some of the federal agents had to wipe their eyes as they witnessed the profound bond between these animals who had endured so much together. But Grace's sacrifice had not been in vain. The evidence she had carried, combined with Henrik's notebook and the contents of the safety deposit box that agents were already securing in Lancaster, would bring down an entire criminal organization and provide justice for all their victims. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cave entrance, casting long shadows across the ancient limestone walls, Ezra held the SD card that had caused so much suffering and realized that it now represented something far more important than evidence of crimes. It represented the proof that love could triumph over evil, that courage could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the smallest among us could change the world through their sacrifice and devotion. The long nightmare was finally over, but the most important part of their story was just beginning. 3 months had passed since that terrible day in the caves, and the first snow of winter was beginning to dust the Pennsylvania countryside with its pristine white blanket. The new Stoltzfus farmhouse, built with the help of their entire Amish community and funded by a grateful federal government as part of their witness protection program, stood proudly where the old one had burned. It was larger than the original, with special accommodations that would have seemed strange to previous generations, but felt perfectly natural to Ezra and Rebecca. The most notable addition was the spacious room on the ground floor that had been designed specifically for Guardian and Hope. Large windows provided views of the rolling fields, and a special door allowed the dogs easy access to a fenced yard where they could run and play without fear. The room was warm and comfortable, filled with soft beds, favorite toys, and the constant presence of the humans who had become their devoted family. Guardian had made a remarkable recovery, his strength returning gradually as Rebecca's patient care and unlimited love helped heal both his body and his traumatized spirit. The German Shepherd mix had grown sleek and powerful again, his dark coat shining with health and his intelligent eyes bright with contentment. But those who knew him well could still see the depth of wisdom and sadness that came from having witnessed things no creature should have to endure. Hope, now nearly 9 months old, had blossomed into a beautiful golden retriever mix whose sunny disposition and boundless energy brought joy to everyone who met him. The puppy who had once been so weak he could barely stand was now a constant whirlwind of motion, chasing butterflies in the garden and stealing socks from the laundry line with the mischievous charm that only young dogs possessed. But it was the absence of Grace that weighed most heavily on all their hearts. The black and white dog, who had sacrificed everything to protect the evidence that brought down Torino's organization, was buried in the place of honor in the Stoltzfus family cemetery. Her grave marked by a beautiful limestone headstone that bore a simple inscription, "Grace, beloved friend and hero, her courage saved us all." Every morning, Guardian would walk to Grace's grave and lie beside it for a few minutes, his head resting on the cool stone as if he were sharing the day's plans with his departed companion. Hope would join him there, not fully understanding why Guardian was sad, but offering the comfort of his presence with the instinctive wisdom of the young. The trial of Vincent Torino and his associates had been concluded just 2 weeks ago, and the verdict had brought a sense of justice that helped ease some of the pain of their losses. Torino himself had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Kane and the others received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. The evidence that Henrik had gathered, combined with Grace's hidden SD card, had exposed a criminal network that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of co-conspirators. But perhaps more importantly, Henrik's story had inspired new legislation protecting whistleblowers and their families, including provisions for the care of animals caught up in criminal investigation. The Henrik Muller Protection Act would ensure that future witnesses wouldn't have to face the same terrible choices that had ultimately cost the gentle old man his life. Jacob Weber had become a frequent visitor to the new Stoltzfus farm, finding peace in the company of the family, who had honored his great-uncle's memory through their courage and sacrifice. He had used Henrik's inheritance to establish a foundation dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating animals who had been victims of criminal abuse, with Guardian and Hope serving as the inspiration and unofficial ambassadors for the cause. It was on a particularly beautiful December morning, as Ezra was doing his chores in the barn with Guardian and Hope following faithfully at his heels, that Rebecca came running from the house, with tears of joy streaming down her face. In her arms was a bundle of blankets that seemed to be moving with a life of its own. "Ezra," she called out, her voice filled with excitement and wonder. "Come quickly. We have a visitor." As Ezra approached, Rebecca carefully pulled back the corner of the blanket to reveal a tiny black and white puppy, no more than a few weeks old, shivering in the cold morning air. The little creature was obviously a stray, probably abandoned and left to die in the harsh winter weather. But it was the puppy's markings that made both Ezra and Rebecca gasp with recognition. The black and white pattern was almost identical to Grace's, so similar that it seemed impossible to be mere coincidence. Even more remarkably, when Guardian saw the puppy, his entire demeanor changed. The big dog approached slowly, his tail wagging gently, and began to sniff the tiny newcomer with the careful attention of a parent examining a long-lost child. Hope, not to be outdone, immediately began trying to wash the puppy's face with his tongue, his excitement evident in every wiggle of his compact body. The puppy, despite being cold and obviously hungry, responded to their gentle attention with tiny squeaks that sounded almost like laughter. "Where did you find her?" Ezra asked, though something deep in his heart already knew that this wasn't a chance encounter. "She was on our front porch," Rebecca said, her voice filled with wonder. "Just sitting there as if she'd been waiting for us to discover her." "Ezra, it's like Grace sent her to us, like she knew we needed another chance to save someone who needed our help." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the veterinarian who had become both friend and confidant during Guardian and Hope's recovery, arrived within an hour of Rebecca's phone call. After a thorough examination, she declared the puppy to be in remarkably good health for a stray, though obviously in need of warmth, food and love. "She's about 6 weeks old," Dr. Morrison said as she watched Guardian gently nuzzling the puppy while Hope danced around them in circles of joy. "Someone took reasonably good care of her for the first part of her life, but she's been on her own for at least several days. You probably saved her life by finding her when you did." As if understanding the gravity of her situation, the puppy looked directly at Ezra with bright, intelligent eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young creature. In that moment, Ezra felt the same connection he had experienced when he first found Grace, Guardian and Hope in Henrik's barn. The recognition of a soul in need, meeting souls prepared to love unconditionally. "What should we call her?" Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already had an idea. "Faith," Ezra said without hesitation, the name coming to him as naturally as breathing. "Her name is Faith, because she represents our faith that love is stronger than evil, that hope can survive the darkest times, and that sometimes the best way to honor those we've lost is to open our hearts to those who still need saving." Guardian seemed to approve of the name, settling down beside the puppy with the protective instincts that had made him such a devoted companion to Grace. Hope, meanwhile, had found one of his favorite toys, a soft rope that squeaked when squeezed, and was trying to interest Faith in a game of tug-of-war. Over the following weeks, as Faith grew stronger and more confident, she began to display personality traits that reminded everyone of Grace. She was intelligent and observant, gentle with smaller creatures, and possessed of a quiet dignity that set her apart from the average puppy. But Faith also brought her own unique gifts to the family, a playful spirit that helped Hope develop his social skills, and a calming presence that seemed to ease Guardian's occasional nightmares about the trauma he had endured. The local newspaper, which had followed their story from the beginning, ran a feature article about Faith's arrival with the headline "Miracle on the Stoltzfus farm, a Christmas gift from heaven." The story touched hearts across the country, and donations poured in to support Jacob's Animal Rescue Foundation from people who had been inspired by the tale of courage, sacrifice, and redemption. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with sunlight streaming through the windows of the Stoltzfus home and illuminating a scene that would have warmed the heart of anyone who believed in the power of love to heal even the deepest wound. Guardian lay contentedly beside the fireplace, Faith curled up against his warm side while Hope dozed nearby with his head resting on Guardian's back. Rebecca was in the kitchen preparing their Christmas feast, humming hymns in Pennsylvania Dutch as she worked. The house was filled with the scents of fresh bread, roasting turkey, and the pine boughs that decorated every room. Outside, fresh snow covered the fields and hills, creating a winter wonderland that seemed to sparkle with promise and peace. Ezra sat in his rocking chair beside the window, holding the framed photograph that Dr. Morrison had taken of all 4 dogs together during Faith's first week with them. Grace's image seemed to watch over the others with serene approval, as if she knew that her sacrifice had led to this moment of perfect contentment. As he looked at the photograph, Ezra reflected on all that had happened since that terrible morning when he had found 3 dying dogs in Henrik's barn. The pain and loss had been almost unbearable at times, but it had also revealed the extraordinary capacity for love and courage that existed in both humans and animals when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. Guardian had taught them about loyalty and protection, showing that strength could be gentle and that the greatest warriors were often those who fought to defend the innocent rather than to conquer the strong. Hope had demonstrated the power of optimism and resilience, proving that even the youngest among us could find reasons to trust and love again after experiencing betrayal and abandonment. Grace, in her brief time with them, had shown the ultimate meaning of sacrifice, choosing to endure suffering and ultimately death to protect evidence that would bring justice to those who had been wronged. Her courage had saved not only her human family, but countless other victims of Torino's criminal organization. And now Faith was teaching them about second chances and the miraculous way that love could create families from the most unlikely circumstances. She was proof that hope could be reborn even in the darkest times, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came not from what we expected, but from what we needed most. A gentle knock at the door interrupted Ezra's contemplation, and he opened it to find Jacob Weber standing on the porch with his arms full of presents and his face glowing with happiness. The younger man had found his way back to faith and family through his connection to the dogs who had changed all their lives, and he had become like a son to Ezra and Rebecca. "Merry Christmas," Jacob said, stamping snow from his boots as he entered the warm house. "I brought gifts for everyone, including some special treats for our 4-legged family members." As Jacob distributed his presents, Guardian, Hope, and Faith gathered around him with the eager anticipation that dogs reserve for their favorite humans. Even Faith, who had been naturally cautious around strangers when she first arrived, now greeted Jacob with tail wags and playful bounces that spoke of complete trust. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a haze of good food, warm conversation, and the simple pleasure of being surrounded by those who mattered most. As evening approached, and Jacob prepared to return to his own home, Ezra walked with him to his truck, while the dogs played in the snow-covered yard. "Uncle Henrik would be so proud," Jacob said, watching Faith and Hope chase each other around Guardian, who supervised their play with the patience of a devoted parent. He always believed that love was the strongest force in the universe, stronger than fear, stronger than greed, stronger even than death. "Looking at what you've built here, at the family you've created from tragedy, I know he was right." As Jacob's truck disappeared down the snow-covered road, Ezra called his 4-legged family inside for the night. Guardian immediately went to his favorite spot beside the fireplace, while Hope and Faith settled down nearby with the contented sighs that dogs make when they know they are truly home. Rebecca joined Ezra on the couch, and together they watched their unusual family as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, snow continued to fall, creating a world of pristine beauty that seemed to wrap their home in peace and protection. "Do you ever wonder what Henrik would think about all this?" Rebecca asked softly, her hand finding Ezra's in the dim light of the fire. Ezra considered the question carefully, thinking about the gentle old man who had started it all with his courage to stand up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. "I think he'd be happy to know that his dogs found a family who loves them, and that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. But mostly, I think he'd be pleased to know that love really did triumph over evil in the end." Guardian lifted his head at the sound of their conversation, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he looked at the humans who had given him a reason to trust again. Beside him, Faith stretched in her sleep, one tiny paw reaching out to touch Hope's golden fur. The 3 dogs breathed in perfect synchronization, their peaceful expressions reflecting the security that came from knowing they were truly and permanently loved. As midnight approached and Christmas gave way to the promise of a new year, Ezra felt a profound sense of gratitude for all that had been lost and all that had been found. Henrik's courage had saved lives and brought justice to those who thought themselves above the law. Grace's sacrifice had ensured that the truth survived, even when those who sought to hide it had unlimited resources and ruthless determination. Guardian's loyalty had shown them the true meaning of devotion, while Hope's resilience had proved that even the most broken spirits could heal when surrounded by unconditional love. And Faith's arrival had demonstrated that miracles could still happen to those who opened their hearts to possibilities beyond their understanding. But perhaps most importantly, their story had shown that sometimes the most ordinary people could become heroes simply by choosing to do what was right, regardless of the cost. An Amish farmer and his wife, 3 abused dogs, and an old man's guilty conscience had combined to bring down a criminal empire and save countless lives. As Ezra turned off the lights and prepared to go upstairs, Guardian rose from his place by the fire and walked to the window that faced Grace's grave. The big dog stood there for a moment, his silhouette outlined against the snowy night, and Ezra could swear he saw the dog nod slightly, as if saying goodnight to a friend who was never truly gone. "Come on, boy," Ezra said softly. "She knows we're thinking of her. She knows we'll never forget." Guardian looked back once more toward the window, then followed his family upstairs, where Faith and Hope had already claimed their spots on the large dog bed that Rebecca had placed in the master bedroom. As the 4 of them settled down for the night, surrounded by the warmth and security of home, the snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in a blanket of peace that felt like a blessing from above. In the morning there would be chores to do, visitors to welcome, and the ongoing work of the Animal Rescue Foundation to support. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of a Pennsylvania winter, a family created by tragedy and bonded by love rested peacefully, knowing that they had found something worth more than all the treasures in the world. They had found each other, and they had learned that love, once given freely and without reservation, could survive anything that evil could devise against it. That was Henrik's true legacy, Grace's lasting gift, and the promise that would guide them through all the years to come. As sleep finally claimed them all, Guardian's dreams were not of the terrible things he had endured, but of sunny fields and warm kitchens, of gentle hands and soft voices, and of the moment when 3 dying dogs had discovered that angels sometimes wore the simple clothes of Amish farmers and spoke in the quiet language of unconditional love. The story that began in tragedy had ended in triumph, and the dogs who had once been victims had become symbols of hope for all who believed that love could conquer even the darkest evil. In the end, that was the most important miracle of all.